My own son told me I was nothing more than a burden. While standing in the house, I sacrificed everything to give him. The words still echo in my empty kitchen, where I now eat dinner alone every single night. Today, I'm going to tell you something I never thought I would share. And if you, for just 1 second, feel that this sounds familiar, I just ask that you leave a like and subscribe, because this story might help someone draw closer to God's love. Amen. My name is Margaret Ellen Thompson, and I'm 73 years old. I live, or rather, I lived, in a modest 2-story house on Elm Street in Springfield, Illinois, where the autumn leaves create a golden carpet that crunches beneath your feet, and where church bells still ring every Sunday morning at 9 o'clock sharp. For 47 years, this house has been my sanctuary, my refuge, the place where I raised my children and buried my husband. This morning, like every morning for the past 2 decades since Robert passed, I woke at 5:30. The house creaks in that familiar way old homes do, settling into another day with the weight of memories pressed into every floorboard. I pulled on my worn terry cloth robe, the blue one with tiny roses that my daughter Linda gave me for Mother's Day 8 years ago, back when she still remembered such things, and made my way downstairs to the kitchen. The coffee maker gurgled to life as I reached for my Bible from its place on the kitchen table, right next to the ceramic salt and pepper shakers shaped like praying hands that Robert bought me on our honeymoon in Gatlinburg. The leather cover is soft and worn from decades of morning devotions, the pages marked with underlined verses and tear stains from countless moments when I needed God's word more than my next breath. "The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want," I whispered, reading Psalm 23 as I've done almost every morning since Robert's funeral. The familiar words usually bring comfort, but lately, they feel more like a prayer than a promise. Because I do want. I want my children to call. I want to matter. I want to feel like the 47 years I spent in this house, raising 3 children and keeping a family together, meant something more than an inconvenience to be managed. The steam from my coffee cup rose in delicate spirals as I sat in Robert's old chair at the kitchen table, the one with the slightly wobbly leg that he always meant to fix but never got around to. From this spot, I can see the bird feeder hanging from the oak tree in the backyard, the tree where my children once had a tire swing, where they carved their initials into the bark, where I used to push them higher and higher while they squealed with delight. Now, only the cardinals visit regularly. Even the birds seem more faithful than my own family. I was halfway through my second cup of coffee when my phone buzzed against the Formica countertop. The screen lit up with a text message from my youngest son, David, and my heart did that little skip it always does when one of my children reaches out. Maybe today would be different. Maybe today, someone would remember that I exist for reasons beyond what I can do for them. Can't make it to Sunday dinner. Something came up. Maybe next week. Just like that. No explanation, no apology, no acknowledgement that I'd already bought the pot roast, already planned the meal around his favorite sides: mashed potatoes with extra butter, green beans with almonds, the cornbread he used to beg me to make when he was little and would stand on a kitchen stool beside me, his small hands helping to measure the cornmeal. I stared at the message until the screen went dark, my reflection staring back at me in the black surface. When did I become so easily dismissed? When did my Sunday dinners, the ones I've been preparing for decades, the ones that used to bring my whole family together around this very table, become optional inconveniences in their busy lives? I set the phone aside and returned to my Bible, but the words blurred through tears I refused to let fall. Not yet. Not over a text message. Not when I still had a whole day ahead of me to fill with purpose, even if that purpose felt increasingly hollow. By noon, the pot roast was in the oven anyway, filling the house with the rich aroma of herbs and onions that used to signal celebration, family, togetherness. Now it just reminded me of how much food would go to waste, how many leftovers I'd be eating alone throughout the week. But I cooked it anyway, because stopping felt like giving up, and I wasn't ready to surrender the rituals that had once defined my role as the heart of this family. The phone rang just as I was setting the table for one, a habit I'd developed to maintain some dignity in my solitude. The caller ID showed my daughter Linda's name, and again, that treacherous hope fluttered in my chest. Maybe she was calling to say she'd changed her mind. Maybe she remembered it was Sunday. "Hi, Mom." Linda's voice carried that particular tone I'd learned to recognize. Rushed, distracted, already moving on to the next item on her endless list of more important things. "Listen, I need a favor. Not, how are you? Not, I was thinking about you. Just, I need a favor." "Of course, sweetheart," I heard myself say, the words automatic after decades of being the family's reliable resource for whatever crisis or convenience they required. "What do you need? Can you pick up Emma from soccer practice on Tuesday? Mark has a client dinner and I have book club. It's just this once." Emma is my granddaughter, Linda's 12-year-old daughter, and one of the few bright spots in my increasingly gray world. But even my relationship with Emma has become filtered through logistics and scheduling, reduced to the times when I'm useful as free childcare rather than valued as a grandmother who might have wisdom to share or stories to tell. "Of course," I repeated, reaching for the notepad where I keep track of such requests. The page was already half filled with similar favors. Grocery runs for Michael when his back was acting up, babysitting for Linda's other children when their usual sitter canceled, picking up prescriptions for David's wife when she was too busy with her yoga classes to manage such mundane tasks herself. When had I become the family's unpaid assistant rather than its matriarch? "Thanks, Mom. You're a lifesaver." The phrase sounded hollow, delivered with the casual dismissiveness reserved for reliable servants. "I've got to run. The kids have about 15 activities today." The line went dead before I could ask about Emma's grades, her friends, whether she was still drawing those beautiful horses she used to sketch for hours. Before I could mention that I'd made her favorite cookies last week and had been waiting for a chance to deliver them. Before I could say that I loved her, missed her, wondered if she ever thought about the grandmother who used to read her bedtime stories and teach her how to braid friendship bracelets. I sat in the kitchen as the afternoon light slanted through the curtains I'd sewn myself 30 years ago, listening to the house settle around me like old bones finding a comfortable position. The pot roast would be perfect in an hour, tender enough to cut with a fork, seasoned exactly the way Robert used to like it. I would eat it alone, save the leftovers in containers that would crowd my refrigerator for days, and pretend that cooking for one person felt like anything other than defeat. Outside, I could hear the neighborhood coming alive with Sunday afternoon activities. Children laughing in backyards, lawnmowers humming their weekend symphony, families gathering for barbecues and birthday parties to which I was never invited. Through my kitchen window, I watched the Hendersons next door setting up tables in their backyard, 3 generations working together to prepare for what looked like a celebration. Grandparents, parents, teenagers, and small children all moving with the easy choreography of people who belong to each other. I used to have that. I used to be the grandmother whose house was the center of family gatherings, whose kitchen was the heart of every holiday, whose wisdom was sought and whose presence was treasured. Now I was the woman who got text message cancellations and requests for favors, whose value was measured entirely by my availability to solve other people's problems. The oven timer chimed, and I pulled out the perfect pot roast that no one would share. As I carved myself a small portion, I found myself talking to the empty kitchen, my voice echoing off the walls that had once contained so much laughter, so many conversations, so much life. "Lord," I whispered, setting my plate on the table set for one, "I know you see me here. I know you know how much it hurts to love people who only remember you exist when they need something. Help me understand why my heart feels so broken when I've tried so hard to be the mother, the grandmother, the woman you wanted me to be." The house remained silent, except for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway, the one Robert wound faithfully every Sunday for 30 years until arthritis made the ritual too painful for his swollen hands. I'd taken over the task after he passed, maintaining this small tradition, even though no one else seemed to notice whether time kept moving forward in our increasingly empty home. As I ate my solitary dinner, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning, that the text message cancellations and casual dismissals were leading somewhere darker, somewhere that would test every ounce of faith I'd spent 73 years building. But I had no idea that within 2 weeks, I would discover just how expendable my own children considered me to be. The last bite of pot roast tasted like tears I still refused to shed. The photo album lay open on my lap, its plastic-covered pages reflecting the soft glow of the table lamp beside Robert's old recliner. Monday evening had settled over the house like a familiar blanket, and I found myself drawn to these captured moments from a time when my love felt valued instead of taken for granted. There was Linda at 7 years old, gap-toothed and grinning, holding up a crayon drawing she'd made of our family. Stick figures with enormous smiles and a house with smoke curling from the chimney like a promise of warmth and belonging. Below it, my own handwriting in faded blue ink, Linda's masterpiece, said it shows how happy we are together. I traced my finger over the image, remembering how she'd insisted on taping it to the refrigerator where everyone could see it. Back then, being part of this family felt like her greatest accomplishment. Now, I couldn't remember the last time she'd voluntarily spent more than 20 minutes in this house. The next page showed Michael's high school graduation, his arm around my shoulders as we posed in front of the gymnasium. I'd worked double shifts at the department store for months to afford his cap and gown, the class ring he'd wanted so desperately, the graduation party that filled our backyard with his friends and their parents. He'd whispered, "Thank you, Mom," in my ear as the photographer snapped this picture. And I'd felt like the richest woman in Springfield. That was before he moved to Chicago and started seeing his mother as an obligation rather than the woman who'd sold her grandmother's jewelry to pay for his college textbooks. David's Little League pictures filled the following pages. Action shots of him sliding into home plate, team photos where he stood proudly in the uniform I'd hand-washed after every game, victory celebrations where chocolate ice cream smeared across his face like war paint. I'd never missed a single game, not even when I was battling the flu or when my manager at the store threatened to cut my hours for requesting too many Saturday mornings off. "We appreciate everything you do, Mrs. Thompson," his coach had told me during the season-ending banquet. David's lucky to have such a dedicated mom. Lucky. That word felt like a cruel joke now, as I sat alone on a Monday night while David lived just 15 minutes away, but might as well have been on another planet for all the effort he made to include me in his life. I closed the album and pressed it against my chest, feeling the weight of all those memories, all those sacrifices that had once felt like investments in relationships that would sustain me through my golden years. Instead, I'd apparently raised 3 strangers who saw me as a convenient resource to be utilized when needed and ignored when not. The phone's shrill ring cut through my melancholy, and I hurried to answer it, hoping against hope that one of my children might be calling just to talk, just to check on me, just to remember that I existed beyond my usefulness. "Mrs. Thompson?" The voice was unfamiliar, professional, with that particular tone that usually preceded bad news or sales pitches. "This is Sharon from Meadowbrook Senior Living. Your son Michael gave us your information and suggested we reach out about our assisted living options." The words hit me like a physical blow, stealing my breath and making my hands tremble as I gripped the phone. Michael had been researching nursing homes. My oldest child, the boy I'd raised alone after Robert's heart attack, had been shopping around for a place to put me away like an outdated piece of furniture. I think there's been some mistake," I managed to say, my voice sounding foreign to my own ears. "I haven't expressed any interest in assisted living." "Oh, I understand completely," Sharon continued with practiced sympathy. "Many seniors feel hesitant about making this transition, but Michael spoke very highly of our community services, and he seemed quite concerned about your safety living alone in such a large house." Safety. As if living independently in the home I'd maintained for decades was somehow dangerous. As if being 73 automatically made me incapable of managing my own life, my own decisions, my own future. "He mentioned some concerns about memory issues," Sharon pressed on, her voice taking on that patronizing tone reserved for the elderly and infirm. "And of course, falls are always a worry at your age. We have wonderful programs here, and our residents really do become like family to each other." Family. The word felt like mockery coming from a stranger trying to sell me on replacing my real family with paid caregivers and institutional activities. My real family, who apparently thought I needed to be managed rather than loved, contained rather than cherished. "I'll need to think about it," I said, ending the call as quickly as possible before my composure cracked completely. I sat in Robert's chair, staring at the phone in my hands as if it were a foreign object, trying to process the magnitude of this betrayal. Michael hadn't just casually mentioned assisted living to me in conversation, giving me a chance to express my own thoughts and feelings about my future. He'd gone behind my back, researched facilities, provided my personal information to strangers, and set in motion a plan to relocate me without my knowledge or consent. This was how much my opinion mattered to the son I'd sacrificed everything to raise. The tears came then, hot and bitter, flowing down my cheeks as I finally allowed myself to feel the full weight of how expendable I'd become. I cried for the mother who'd worked 16-hour days to afford Michael's college tuition, who'd sold her car to pay for Linda's wedding dress, who'd taken out a second mortgage to help David through his divorce. I cried for the grandmother who'd been relegated to emergency babysitter, whose presence was tolerated rather than celebrated, whose love had become a burden rather than a gift. Lord Jesus, I whispered through my tears. I don't understand what I did wrong. I loved them with everything I had. I gave them everything I could. Why does it feel like they're planning my funeral while I'm still alive? The house remained silent except for my muffled sobs and the distant hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Even my prayers felt like they were bouncing off the ceiling, returning to me unanswered and empty. I thought about Robert then, about how different things had been when he was alive. He'd been my partner in loving our children, my ally in the daily battles of parenthood, my witness to the sacrifices we'd both made to give them the best life possible. He'd seen my value, had told me regularly how grateful he was for the woman who'd made our house a home, who'd turned our children into decent human beings, who'd created the foundation upon which our family was built. I miss you so much, I whispered to his empty chair, to the space where his presence used to fill the room with warmth and purpose. I miss having someone who remembered why I mattered. The grandfather clock chimed 9 o'clock, marking another hour and another day of feeling invisible in my own life. I picked up my Bible from the side table, its familiar weight comforting in my hands, and opened it to the book of Job. If anyone understood feeling abandoned by those who should have offered comfort, it was Job. Though he slay me, yet will I trust in him, I read aloud, my voice echoing in the empty living room. The words felt like sandpaper against my wounded heart, challenging me to maintain faith even when that faith felt like the only thing I had left. I thought about tomorrow, about the phone call I knew I'd have to make to Michael, about the conversation that would force me to confront this betrayal directly. Part of me wanted to pretend the nursing home call had never happened, to maintain the illusion that my children respected my autonomy, even if they didn't demonstrate their love. But ignoring the problem wouldn't make it disappear, and I'd spent too many years enabling their casual dismissal of my feelings to continue that pattern now. As I prepared for bed, going through the nightly ritual of checking locks and turning off lights in a house that felt too big and too empty for one person, I made a decision. Tomorrow, I would call Michael. I would ask him directly about his assisted living research. I would demand an explanation for why he thought he had the right to make decisions about my future without including me in the conversation. I would stop being the convenient, compliant mother who absorbed every slight without complaint. It was time to find out exactly how my children saw me, even if the truth destroyed what little remained of my illusions about our family bonds. Kneeling beside my bed in the flannel nightgown Linda had given me 3 Christmases ago, I folded my hands and closed my eyes, searching for words that could express the depth of my hurt and confusion. "Dear Father," I began, my voice trembling in the darkness, "I know you see everything. You see how hard I've tried to be the mother you wanted me to be. You see how much I love these children, even when they make me feel like loving them was a mistake. Please help me understand your plan in all this pain. Please help me find the strength to speak truth tomorrow, even if that truth changes everything. And please, if it's your will, help them remember that I'm still their mother, not just a problem to be solved." I climbed into bed, pulling Robert's pillow close to my chest, breathing in the faint scent of his cologne that still lingered in the fabric after all these years. Tomorrow would bring difficult conversations and possibly devastating revelations. But tonight, I would hold on to faith, even if that faith felt as fragile as tissue paper in a hurricane. "Am I being tested, Lord, or just forgotten?" I whispered into the darkness, not sure I was ready to hear the answer. Tuesday morning arrived gray and drizzling, the kind of October weather that seeps into your bones and makes everything feel heavier than it should. I sat at my kitchen table staring at my phone for 20 minutes before finally gathering the courage to dial Michael's number. My coffee had grown cold while I rehearsed what I would say. How I would confront him about the nursing home call without sounding accusatory or desperate. The phone rang 4 times before going to voicemail. His recorded voice, cheerful and professional, invited me to leave a message and promised he'd return my call as soon as possible. That phrase had lost all meaning over the past few years. Michael's "as soon as possible" usually meant sometime within the next week if I was lucky. "Michael, it's Mom," I said to the machine, hating how small my voice sounded. "I need to talk to you about something important. Please call me back today." I hung up and immediately felt foolish for saying please to my own son, as if requesting a conversation with him was asking for a favor, rather than expecting basic courtesy from someone I'd raised and loved unconditionally for 34 years. The morning stretched endlessly ahead of me. I tried to distract myself with household tasks, folding laundry that would sit in baskets for days since I was the only one wearing and washing clothes in this house, dusting furniture that rarely got dirty because no one visited to disturb the carefully maintained surfaces, organizing pantry shelves stocked with food I'd bought out of habit rather than need. Every mundane chore reminded me of how purposeless my daily routine had become. I was maintaining a home for ghosts, preserving a life that existed more in memory than reality. At 11:30, my phone finally rang. Michael's name appeared on the caller ID, and I felt that familiar mixture of relief and anxiety that characterized all my interactions with my children now. "Hi, Mom. Got your message. What's up?" No apology for the delay, no warmth in his voice. Just the brisk efficiency of someone checking an item off his to-do list. "I received a call yesterday," I began, my hands trembling slightly as I gripped the phone. "From a place called Meadowbrook Senior Living. They said you'd given them my information." The silence on the other end stretched long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. When Michael finally spoke, his tone had shifted to that patronizing register I'd grown to despise, the voice he used when he thought he knew what was best for me better than I knew myself. "Mom, I was going to talk to you about that. Linda and David and I have been discussing some concerns." Concerns. They'd been having family meetings about me, planning my future in conversations that didn't include the person most affected by their decisions. The revelation hit me like a physical blow, stealing my breath and making my vision blur with tears I refused to let fall. "What concerns?" I managed to ask, though I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. "Well, you're getting older, and that house is really too big for one person. We worry about you falling down those stairs or having a medical emergency with no one around to help. And honestly, Mom, some of the things you've said lately, we think you might be having some memory issues." Memory issues. The phrase hung in the air like an accusation. I searched my mind frantically, trying to remember any instances of confusion or forgetfulness that might have prompted this assessment of my mental capacity. Yes, I sometimes lost my car keys or forgot what day it was. Normal occurrences for anyone living alone without the anchor of other people's schedules to mark time. But memory issues serious enough to warrant assisted living? "What things?" I demanded, finding my voice stronger now, fueled by indignation. "What have I said that makes you think I'm losing my mind? Last month you called me 3 times in one day asking if I was coming to dinner, and you seemed confused when I reminded you that we'd already talked about my work schedule conflicting with Sunday meals." I remembered those calls now. I'd called the first time to confirm our usual Sunday arrangement, as I did every week. The second call came after I'd seen a car that looked like his in my driveway and thought he might have arrived early. The third call was made after I'd been cooking all afternoon and realized I wasn't entirely sure he'd confirmed his attendance. But the way Michael told it, I sounded like a confused elderly woman harassing her busy son with repetitive, unnecessary phone calls. My attempts to maintain connection had been reframed as evidence of cognitive decline. "Michael," I said slowly, "I called 3 times because I wanted to make sure you were still coming. Because you've canceled our Sunday dinners 8 times in the past 3 months, usually with less than 2 hours' notice. I was trying to avoid cooking a meal that would go to waste." "See, that's what I mean," he said, his voice taking on that patient tone people use with small children and the mentally impaired. "You're keeping track of things like that, getting upset over normal schedule changes. It's not healthy, Mom. Not healthy. My desire to spend time with my children, my disappointment when they repeatedly canceled plans, my efforts to maintain family traditions. All of this had been pathologized as symptoms of decline rather than recognized as the natural responses of a mother who felt increasingly isolated and dismissed. So you decided, without talking to me, that I need to be put in a home? It's not putting you anywhere, Mom. It's helping you transition to a community where you'll have people around, activities to keep you engaged, medical care if you need it. You'd make friends there. Friends. As if the relationships formed among strangers thrown together by circumstance could replace the family bonds I'd spent decades nurturing, only to watch them wither from neglect and casual cruelty. And what if I don't want to transition anywhere? What if I want to stay in my own home, the house your father and I bought together, the place where I raised you and your sister and brother? The pause that followed felt loaded with all the conversations Michael had apparently been having behind my back, all the decisions that had been made about my life without my input. Mom, be realistic. You can't maintain that house much longer. The mortgage payments alone are none of your business, I interrupted, surprising myself with the sharpness in my voice. I've been managing my finances for 73 years, including the 18 years I raised you children alone after your father died. That's exactly my point. You've been carrying that burden for too long. It's time to let other people take care of things. Burden. The word landed like a slap across my face. My home, my independence, my very existence had become a burden that needed to be managed by people who saw me as a problem to be solved, rather than a person to be loved. I have to go, I said, no longer trusting myself to remain civil. I have an appointment. I hung up before Michael could respond, before he could offer more patronizing explanations for why my own children had concluded that my life needed to be reorganized to better suit their convenience. The house felt different after that conversation, as if the walls themselves had heard the discussion and were now pressing closer, making the space feel less like a sanctuary and more like evidence of my inability to manage my own existence. I walked through rooms that had once represented accomplishment and security, seeing them now through my children's eyes, obstacles to overcome, responsibilities to be transferred, problems requiring solutions that didn't include my preferences or feelings. I found myself in the living room, standing before the mantelpiece where family photos had once created a gallery of love and belonging. Most of those pictures were gone now, removed during various cleaning visits when my children had decided which memories were worth preserving and which could be discarded. The few remaining images looked lonely and arbitrary, like survivors of a disaster that had claimed everything meaningful. That afternoon, I drove to the grocery store, needing to escape the house that suddenly felt like a prison rather than a home. The automatic doors slid open with their familiar whoosh, and I grabbed a shopping cart, moving through the aisles without any real purpose beyond the desperate need to be around other people, even strangers who wouldn't acknowledge my existence. In the produce section, I watched a young mother selecting apples while her toddler sat in the cart, chattering about everything he saw. The woman responded to each observation with patience and delight, treating his simple words as fascinating insights worthy of her full attention. I remembered being that mother, finding joy in the most mundane grocery trips because they were opportunities to teach and connect with my children. Now I shopped alone, selecting items for meals I would eat in solitude, engaging in brief, polite exchanges with cashiers who saw hundreds of customers each day and would never remember my face or wonder about the life I returned to after leaving their checkout line. "Did you find everything you needed today?" the teenage cashier asked with practiced cheerfulness as she scanned my modest collection of items: soup, crackers, tea, a small container of ice cream that I bought, knowing I'd probably eat the entire thing in one sitting while sitting in Robert's chair, staring at walls that held more conversation than my phone. "Yes, thank you," I replied, though the question felt absurd. What I needed couldn't be found in any store. What I needed was to matter to someone, to feel valued for more than my usefulness, to have my love received as a gift, rather than tolerated as an obligation. That evening, I sat in my kitchen with a cup of tea growing cold between my hands, watching the neighbors across the street through my window. The Patterson family was having their weekly barbecue, 3 generations gathered around picnic tables in their backyard. Grandparents, parents, teenagers, and small children all moving together in the easy choreography of people who belong to each other. Mrs. Patterson, who was roughly my age, sat in a lawn chair surrounded by grandchildren who climbed on her lap and brought her dandelion bouquets and listened with rapt attention to whatever stories she was telling. Her presence wasn't tolerated or managed. It was celebrated, cherished, treated as the treasure it should be. I closed my eyes and tried to pray, but the words felt stuck in my throat, blocked by a growing sense that God had somehow overlooked my situation, that my prayers were bouncing off a ceiling that had grown too thick for divine intervention to penetrate. "Lord," I finally whispered, "I'm starting to wonder if you can even see me anymore. If my own children think I'm invisible, how do I know you remember I exist?" The kitchen remained silent except for the tick of the wall clock and the distant sound of laughter from the Patterson barbecue. Even my prayers felt like conversations with empty air, words spoken to walls that absorbed them without response or acknowledgement. For the first time in my 73 years, I wondered if faith was just another burden I'd been carrying too long, another weight that needed to be set down before it crushed what little remained of my spirit. The thought terrified me more than any nursing home ever could. Thursday afternoon brought an unexpected visitor. I was in my garden, deadheading the last roses of the season, when I heard the familiar rumble of David's truck in my driveway. My youngest son emerged wearing his work clothes, paint-stained jeans and a flannel shirt that had seen better days, carrying what appeared to be a manila folder under his arm. "Hi, Mom," he called out, his voice carrying an artificial cheerfulness that immediately put me on guard. David had inherited Robert's easy smile, but today it felt forced, like a mask he'd put on specifically for this visit. "David, what a surprise," I said, pulling off my gardening gloves and walking toward him. "You should have called. I would have made some coffee." "Actually, I can't stay long," he replied, glancing at his watch in a gesture that felt rehearsed. "I just wanted to drop something off and chat for a few minutes." We settled at my kitchen table, the same spot where I'd received that devastating phone call from Michael just 2 days earlier. David placed the manila folder on the table between us, but didn't immediately open it, instead fidgeting with the edge of the envelope like someone steeling himself for an unpleasant task. "Mom, Michael told me about your conversation on Tuesday." Of course he had. The three of them really were coordinating their approach to the Margaret problem, sharing strategies and comparing notes like generals planning a campaign. "He's worried he might have upset you," David continued, "but we all think it's important that you understand we're coming from a place of love." Love. The word felt increasingly meaningless when applied to the systematic dismantling of my autonomy and dignity that my children seemed determined to accomplish. "I'm listening," I said, though every instinct told me I wasn't going to like whatever came next. David opened the folder and pulled out several sheets of paper, printouts from real estate websites showing comparable home sales in my neighborhood. The houses displayed on these pages were similar to mine in size and age, with sale prices that made my breath catch in my throat. "Mom, do you have any idea what your house is worth now?" David asked, spreading the printouts across my kitchen table like a real estate agent making a presentation to prospective sellers. The numbers were staggering. Houses on my street that had sold for $30,000 or $40,000 when Robert and I were young parents were now listed for amounts that seemed impossible. $200,000, $250,000, even $300,000 for the larger properties with updated kitchens and bathrooms. I hadn't really thought about it, I admitted, studying the pages with growing unease. "It's my home, not an investment." But that's exactly the point," David said, leaning forward with the enthusiasm of someone who thought he was solving a problem rather than creating one. "You're sitting on a gold mine here, Mom. This house could fund a really comfortable retirement for you." Retirement. As if the life I'd been living, managing my own home, maintaining my independence, staying connected to the community where I'd spent most of my adult life, was somehow pre-retirement rather than the actual living I wanted to continue doing. "A comfortable retirement where?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. "Well, that's where Meadowbrook comes in," David said, pulling out another set of papers, a glossy brochure featuring smiling seniors engaged in various activities. "Linda drove over there yesterday to check it out, and she said it's really nice. They have everything: activities coordinators, chef-prepared meals, housekeeping services, medical staff on site." Linda had visited the nursing home. My daughter had taken time out of her busy schedule to tour facilities where I might be relocated, but she hadn't found time to visit her own mother in months. "The monthly fee seems steep at first," David continued, apparently interpreting my silence as interest rather than horror. "But when you factor in what you'd get from selling this place, you'd have enough to cover several years of care, plus a nice nest egg left over." Care. They weren't talking about a place where I could live independently. They were talking about a place where I would be cared for, like an invalid, or a child who couldn't manage her own basic needs. "And what about the nest egg?" I asked, my voice steady despite the trembling in my hands. "What happens to that money?" David's pause was just a fraction too long, his glance away just a little too obvious. When he looked back at me, his expression had shifted slightly, revealing something calculated beneath the concerned son performance. "Well, obviously that would be part of your estate eventually. But in the meantime, if you needed help managing finances or making decisions about investments, we'd be happy to help with that too." There it was, the real reason behind their sudden concern for my welfare, their urgent need to relocate me to assisted living, their family meetings and research into facilities. They weren't trying to protect me. They were positioning themselves to inherit the proceeds from my home while I was still alive to sign the papers. The realization hit me like a physical blow, stealing my breath and making the kitchen seem to tilt around me. These weren't the children I'd raised, the babies I'd held and fed and comforted through nightmares. These were strangers wearing familiar faces, calculating the value of my life's work, and making plans to claim it for themselves. "You want me to sell my home," I said slowly, "so you can get your inheritance early." "Mom, that's not—" David started, but his protest sounded hollow even to him. "That's exactly what this is," I continued, my voice growing stronger as the truth crystallized. "You and Michael and Linda have decided that I'm inconveniently still alive and healthy enough to live independently, so you've invented concerns about my safety and my memory to justify putting me somewhere I can be monitored and managed while you take control of my assets." David's face flushed red, whether from shame or anger I couldn't tell. "That's not fair, Mom. We genuinely worry about you living alone in this big house." "Do you?" I asked, standing up from the table and looking down at my youngest child, the boy I'd rocked to sleep thousands of nights, whose scraped knees I'd bandaged and whose broken heart I'd mended when his first girlfriend broke up with him in high school. "When's the last time any of you visited long enough to assess whether I'm actually having trouble managing this house? When's the last time you called just to check on me, not to ask for a favor or cancel plans?" David couldn't answer because we both knew the truth. Their concern for my welfare was as manufactured as their affection had become, convenient emotions deployed when they served a purpose, absent when genuine care might require effort or sacrifice on their part. "I think you should leave," I said, my voice quiet but firm. "Take your real estate listings and your nursing home brochures and your helpful suggestions about my finances. I'll manage my own life. Thank you." "Mom, please don't be like this," David said, gathering up his papers with obvious frustration. "We're trying to help you plan for the future." "Whose future?" I asked. "Mine or yours?" After he left, I sat alone in my kitchen, staring at the table where the evidence of my children's betrayal had been so casually displayed. They'd researched my home's value, toured assisted living facilities, and calculated how much money they could access if they convinced me to give up my independence. All of this had been done without my knowledge or consent, planned in conversations that treated me like an asset to be liquidated rather than a person to be loved. I thought about all the times I'd helped them financially over the years, the college tuition payments, the wedding expenses, the down payment assistance, the emergency loans that were never repaid. I'd given freely, gladly, because that's what mothers do for their children. I'd never expected gratitude, but I'd never imagined that my generosity would be repaid with schemes to separate me from everything I'd worked to build. The phone rang just after 5 o'clock. Linda's name appeared on the caller ID, and I almost didn't answer. But curiosity about how she would approach this conversation after David's failed presentation compelled me to pick up. "Hi, Mom. David said he stopped by today." No greeting, no inquiry about my well-being. Just a direct acknowledgement that they were coordinating their efforts to wear down my resistance. "Yes, he did, with some very interesting paperwork. Mom, I know this feels overwhelming, but we really think Meadowbrook could be perfect for you. I took the tour yesterday and the residents seem so happy. There's a woman there who's 81 and still plays piano for the other residents. They have book clubs and gardening groups, and even day trips to museums and theaters. Activities designed to keep elderly people occupied and content, like programs at a well-funded daycare center. The comparison wasn't lost on me. My children were trying to convince me to accept the same kind of managed existence they'd provided for their own children, except I would be paying for the privilege of having my choices made for me." "Linda," I said, "I need you to answer one question honestly. If I sell this house and move to assisted living, what happens to the money that's left over after paying for my care?" The silence stretched so long, I wondered if the call had dropped. When Linda finally spoke, her voice had lost its persuasive warmth. "Well, obviously we'd want to make sure it's invested wisely. Michael has connections in financial planning, and David's been learning about estate management. We'd make sure you get the best possible returns." "That's not what I asked," I pressed. "I asked what happens to that money. Mom, why are you making this so difficult? We're trying to help you. By taking control of my finances and my living situation? By making decisions about my future without including me in the conversation? That's not help, Linda. That's theft disguised as concern. You're being paranoid," Linda snapped, her facade of patient concern finally cracking. "Maybe that's another sign that you need more support than you're willing to admit." There it was again. Any resistance to their plans was reframed as evidence of cognitive decline, any assertion of my own preferences dismissed as symptoms of confusion or paranoia. They'd created a perfect catch-22. If I agreed to their plans, I was making a wise decision. If I resisted, I was proving that I lacked the judgment to make my own choices. "I'm hanging up now," I said. "Don't call me again unless you're prepared to apologize for treating me like a bank account with legs instead of the mother who sacrificed everything to raise you." I ended the call and immediately turned off my phone, needing silence to process the magnitude of what I'd discovered. My children weren't just neglecting me, they were actively plotting to exploit me. The nursing home wasn't about my safety or happiness. It was about gaining access to my assets while I was still alive to authorize the transfer. That night, I knelt beside my bed as I had every night for decades. But the words wouldn't come. How do you pray when the people you've loved most in the world have revealed themselves to be predators? How do you maintain faith when even your own children see you as prey? "Lord," I whispered finally, "I don't understand why you're allowing this to happen. I raised them to be good people, to honor their parents, to treat others with kindness and respect. Where did I go wrong? Where did you go wrong?" The blasphemy of that last question shocked me, but I couldn't take it back. For the first time in my life, I was questioning not just God's plan, but God's competence. If He could allow my own children to plot against me with such cold calculation, what did that say about His love, His justice, His protection of the innocent? Outside my window, the October wind rattled the bare branches of the oak tree where my children had once played, where I'd pushed them on swings and caught them when they jumped from the lower branches. Those children were gone now, replaced by strangers who measured my worth in square footage and mortgage equity. I pulled Robert's pillow close to my chest and cried myself to sleep, wondering if this was how Jesus felt in the Garden of Gethsemane, abandoned by those who should have stood by Him, facing betrayal from people He'd loved without reservation. The difference was that Jesus knew His suffering had purpose. I couldn't see any purpose in mine beyond providing my children with an early inheritance, and the convenience of not having to pretend they cared about me anymore. Would Jesus forgive this too? I whispered into the darkness. Should I forgive again? But even as I asked the question, I knew I was running out of cheeks to turn, out of understanding to offer, out of love to give to people who only took and never gave back. Maybe it was time to stop being the mother they could exploit and start being the woman God had created me to be, someone worthy of respect, regardless of whether my own children were capable of providing it. Friday morning arrived with the kind of crisp autumn clarity that makes everything look sharper, more defined. I woke before dawn, as had become my habit, but instead of reaching immediately for my Bible, I found myself staring at the ceiling, listening to the profound silence that had become my constant companion. For the first time in decades, I didn't feel compelled to fill that silence with prayer or scripture reading, or the desperate internal monologue that had been consuming my thoughts since discovering my children's true motivations. Instead, I simply lay still and listened, to my own breathing, to the house settling around me, to something deeper that I couldn't quite name yet. It was in that silence that clarity began to emerge, like a photograph developing in a dark room. All the fog of confusion and self-doubt that my children had been deliberately cultivating started to lift, revealing the simple truth I'd been unable to see through my hurt and disappointment. I was not the problem. I was not confused, declining, or unable to manage my own life. I was a 73-year-old woman who had raised 3 children, maintained a home for nearly 5 decades, and managed her finances responsibly through decades of economic ups and downs. The only thing wrong with me was that I had been allowing people who didn't love me to convince me that their evaluation of my worth mattered more than my own. I got up and made coffee, but instead of sitting in my usual spot at the kitchen table, I carried my mug out to the front porch and settled into the wicker chair that Robert had bought me for our 20th anniversary. The morning air was cool against my face, and I watched my neighborhood come to life. Commuters backing out of driveways, children walking to school with backpacks bouncing against their shoulders, Mrs. Patterson across the street watering her flower boxes. Normal life, continuing all around me, while I had been trapped in a drama of manipulation and emotional blackmail that had nothing to do with the reality of my actual circumstances. I thought about Emma, my granddaughter, and realized with a start that I hadn't seen her in over 2 months. Linda always had excuses: soccer practice, sleepovers, homework. But now I understood that those excuses were part of the systematic isolation my children had been orchestrating. They'd been gradually removing me from their lives, creating distance that would make my eventual relocation to assisted living seem natural rather than devastating. But Emma was 12 years old enough to have her own opinions about whether she wanted to spend time with her grandmother, old enough to be given a choice about maintaining our relationship, regardless of what her mother preferred. I went back inside and picked up my phone, which I'd turned off the previous evening after Linda's manipulative conversation. When it powered up, I found 3 missed calls from Michael and 2 voicemails I didn't bother listening to. Instead, I scrolled through my contacts until I found the number for Lincoln Elementary School, where Emma was in 7th grade. Lincoln Elementary, this is Mrs. Rodriguez, the cheerful voice answered. Hello, this is Margaret Thompson, Emma Walsh's grandmother. I was wondering if I could arrange to pick her up from school today instead of her usual ride. Of course, Mrs. Thompson. I'll just need to verify that with Emma's mother. Is Mrs. Walsh expecting you to pick up Emma today? The question hung in the air, and I realized I was at a crossroads. I could make up some story about Linda asking me to help, could fabricate an emergency that would justify my presence, or I could tell the truth and risk being denied access to my own granddaughter. No, I said finally. She's not expecting it, but I'm Emma's grandmother, and I'd like to spend some time with her. I was hoping you could ask Emma if she'd like to come home with me for the afternoon. There was a pause, and I could hear Mrs. Rodriguez consulting with someone in the background. When she returned to the phone, her voice was kind but cautious. Mrs. Thompson, I understand you'd like to see your granddaughter, but our policy requires parental permission for any changes to pickup arrangements. Could you have Mrs. Walsh call us to authorize the change? I hung up without answering, knowing that Linda would never grant such permission, not because she was concerned for Emma's safety, but because allowing me unsupervised time with my granddaughter would interfere with the narrative of decline and confusion they'd been constructing to justify their plans for my future. I sat in Robert's chair, holding my cold coffee and feeling the weight of how completely they'd isolated me from everything and everyone I cared about. But instead of sinking into despair, I felt something else stirring, a quiet determination that surprised me with its strength. If they wanted to treat me like an adversary, then perhaps it was time to stop pretending we were family and start protecting myself accordingly. I walked to the small desk in my living room where I kept important papers and pulled out the business card that had been sitting there for 3 years. Ever since my neighbor, Mrs. Chen, had recommended her attorney during her own difficult divorce proceedings. James Morrison was supposed to be excellent at protecting people's interests when family relationships became complicated by financial considerations. The receptionist who answered was professional and efficient, and within minutes I had an appointment scheduled for Monday morning. When she asked about the nature of my legal needs, I found myself speaking more clearly than I had in months. I need to protect my assets from family members who are trying to manipulate me into giving up my independence and my home. Saying it out loud, stating the situation in such direct terms, felt like stepping out of a fog that had been obscuring my vision for months. These weren't complicated family dynamics or generational misunderstandings. This was attempted financial elder abuse, and I had legal rights that didn't depend on my children's approval or cooperation. After scheduling the appointment, I did something I hadn't done in years. I called my bank and asked to speak with someone about my accounts. The customer service representative was helpful and patient as I requested detailed statements for all my accounts going back 2 years, including any instances where my children had been given information about my finances. What I discovered made my blood run cold. Michael had been listed as a joint account holder on my savings account, something I didn't remember authorizing, but which must have happened during one of his helpful visits when he'd insisted on updating my paperwork. He hadn't withdrawn any money yet, but he had legal access to every penny I'd saved over the past 47 years. I want to remove all joint account holders immediately, I told the representative, my voice steady despite the trembling in my hands. And I want to be notified of any attempts to access my accounts or request information about them. Certainly, Mrs. Thompson. I'll need you to come in with proper identification to make those changes. Would Monday afternoon work for you? Monday afternoon, the same day as my attorney appointment. It felt like divine timing, as if the universe was finally aligning to help me protect myself, instead of leaving me vulnerable to people who saw my trust as weakness to be exploited. That evening, I cooked dinner for one person without apologizing to myself for the decision. I made exactly what I wanted, a simple grilled cheese sandwich and tomato soup, and ate it while watching the sunset through my kitchen window instead of the mindless television programs I'd been using to fill the silence. As darkness fell, I found myself drawn to my Bible for the first time since David's devastating visit. But instead of reading familiar passages about forgiveness and turning the other cheek, I found myself in the book of Nehemiah, reading about rebuilding walls and protecting what was valuable from those who would tear it down. Remember, O my God, Tobiah and Sanballat according to these their works, I read aloud, my voice echoing in the quiet kitchen. For they were trying to intimidate us, thinking, their hands will get too weak for the work, and it will not be completed. The words seemed to speak directly to my situation. My children were trying to intimidate me into giving up the work of maintaining my independence, hoping my hands would grow too weak to continue protecting what I'd built. But Nehemiah hadn't given in to intimidation, and neither would I. I closed the Bible and walked through my house, really looking at it for the first time in months. This wasn't just a building to be liquidated for its cash value. This was the place where I'd held my babies during midnight feedings, where I'd nursed Robert through his final illness, where I'd found peace and purpose in the daily rhythms of homemaking and hospitality. The walls held 47 years of Christmas mornings and birthday celebrations, of homework sessions at the kitchen table, and bedtime stories read in small bedrooms that still carried the faint scent of the children who'd outgrown them. The garden outside held roses I'd planted to mark significant anniversaries, vegetables I'd grown to feed my family, herbs I'd dried to season countless meals prepared with love. This house wasn't too big for me. It was exactly the right size for a life lived fully, for a woman who had earned the right to occupy space without apology or justification. I went to bed that night without praying for my children's change of heart, or for healing in our relationship. Instead, I prayed for strength to protect myself, for wisdom to make good decisions, and for the courage to value my own well-being as much as I'd always valued theirs. Lord, I whispered into the darkness, I don't know if this is what you want for me, but I can't keep allowing myself to be destroyed by people who don't love me. Help me find the balance between forgiveness and self-protection. Help me be wise as a serpent and gentle as a dove. For the first time in months, I slept deeply and peacefully, untroubled by guilt or self-doubt. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but it would also bring new opportunities to choose myself, to honor the life God had given me, and to stop sacrificing my well-being on the altar of other people's convenience. The silence that had once felt like abandonment now felt like sacred space, room for my own thoughts to develop without the constant noise of other people's demands and expectations. In that silence, I could finally hear my own voice, and it was stronger than I'd remembered. Sunday morning arrived gray and misty, and for the first time in 3 years, I didn't get dressed for church. Not because I'd lost faith, but because I needed to spend time with God without the distraction of performing normalcy for people who would ask polite questions about my family while having no real interest in the honest answers. Instead, I sat in my garden with my coffee and my Bible, watching the last roses of the season open their faces to whatever weak sunlight filtered through the clouds. I read about David facing Goliath, about Esther approaching the king uninvited, about ordinary people finding extraordinary courage when their backs were against the wall. I thought about Emma, about Mrs. Patterson across the street, about all the relationships in my life that existed beyond my children's approval or control. My worth wasn't determined by 3 people who'd forgotten how to love me. My value wasn't measured by my usefulness to people who took everything and gave nothing back. I was Margaret Ellen Thompson, beloved daughter of the Most High God, widow of a good man, mother of 3 adults who'd lost their way, and a woman who still had important work to do in this world. That work might not include enabling their selfishness any longer, but it would definitely include protecting the life and independence I'd worked so hard to build. Monday morning, I would begin the process of building walls around what mattered most, not to keep love out, but to keep predators at bay. And if my own children had chosen to be predators rather than family, then they would have to live with the consequences of that choice. I was done being their victim. It was time to start being their mother again. The kind of mother who loved enough to say no when yes would cause harm, who cared enough to protect herself so she could continue being available to those who actually valued her presence in their lives. The first step toward freedom had been recognizing that I had the right to take it. The second step would be taken Monday morning, when I walked into that attorney's office and began the process of reclaiming my life from people who'd mistaken my love for weakness and my generosity for stupidity. God had been listening all along. He'd just been waiting for me to stop asking for other people to change and start asking for the strength to change what I could, which was everything about how I allowed myself to be treated. The silence hadn't been abandonment. It had been preparation. Monday evening brought an ambush I should have anticipated. I had just returned from the most empowering day I'd experienced in years, meeting with attorney James Morrison, who confirmed that my children's behavior constituted textbook financial elder abuse, and visiting the bank to secure my accounts with new passwords and restrictions that would prevent any unauthorized access. I was sitting in my kitchen, reviewing the legal documents Mr. Morrison had given me, when I heard the unmistakable sound of multiple car doors slamming in my driveway. Through the window, I watched my 3 children emerge from their vehicles with the coordinated precision of a military operation. Michael carried a leather briefcase. Linda held a manila folder. David walked slightly behind them, his expression already apologetic in that weak way he'd perfected whenever he knew he was participating in something he couldn't defend. They hadn't called. They hadn't asked permission to visit. They'd simply decided that their mother's home was still their territory to invade whenever their agenda required it. I met them at the front door, not opening it fully, keeping the screen door latched between us. A small barrier, but symbolically important. For the first time in decades, I wasn't automatically welcoming my children into my space simply because they'd decided to occupy it. "Mom, we need to talk," Michael announced, his voice carrying the authority he used in business negotiations. "This has gone on long enough." "You're right," I replied, surprising them all with my calm agreement. "It has gone on long enough, but we'll talk on my terms. not yours. I unlocked the screen door and stepped back, allowing them to enter my living room where they arranged themselves like a tribunal. Michael in the center, Linda to his right, David hovering near the doorway as if he might need to escape quickly. "Sit down, Mom," Linda said, gesturing toward Robert's chair as if she were granting me permission to use furniture in my own home. "I'll stand, thank you," I said, positioning myself near the mantelpiece where family photos had once created a gallery of love, but now held only a few scattered images of happier times. From this position, I could look down at them, could maintain the psychological advantage of height and mobility while they sat in the low furniture they'd arranged for their convenience. Michael opened his briefcase with theatrical precision, pulling out documents that I recognized immediately: copies of real estate listings, assisted living brochures, and what appeared to be financial planning worksheets covered with calculations I hadn't authorized. "Mom, after our conversations last week, we've done more research," he began, his tone suggesting that their research gave them authority over my decisions. "We've found an even better facility than Meadowbrook. Sunset Manor has an immediate opening, and they're offering a move-in special that could save you thousands of dollars. We've also gotten preliminary approval for the sale of this house," Linda added, pulling documents from her own folder. "The realtor thinks we could list it this week and have offers within days. The market is really hot right now. And I've been looking into financial management services," David chimed in, his voice carrying less conviction than his siblings, but still participating in this orchestrated assault on my autonomy. "Michael's friend can help invest the proceeds to maximize your return." They talked about me as if I weren't standing 3 feet away from them, as if my life were a business problem they'd been hired to solve rather than a human existence that belonged to me. Their casual assumption that they could make these decisions, could arrange my future without my meaningful input, revealed how completely they'd dehumanized me in their own minds. "Are you finished?" I asked when their presentation concluded. "Mom, we know this feels overwhelming," Michael said, his voice taking on that patronizing tone I'd grown to despise. "But sometimes people who are struggling with cognitive issues need family members to step in and help with major decisions." Cognitive issues? There it was again. The lie they'd decided to tell about my mental state to justify their theft of my independence and assets. They'd probably been sharing this fiction with friends and colleagues, building a narrative that would make their actions seem compassionate rather than exploitative. "Michael," I said, my voice steady and clear, "I want you to look at me carefully and tell me if you see any evidence of cognitive issues, any confusion, any inability to follow this conversation, any difficulty understanding exactly what you're trying to do to me." He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, perhaps recognizing that his mother was demonstrating perfect mental clarity while calling out his lies directly. "The point is," Linda interrupted, "we can't just sit back and watch you struggle alone anymore. We love you too much to let you deteriorate in this house by yourself." Love. They kept using that word as a weapon, as if genuine love could be expressed through deception, manipulation, and the systematic destruction of everything that gave my life meaning and purpose. "Let me tell you what love actually looks like," I said, walking closer to where they sat in judgment of my life. "Love calls before showing up uninvited. Love asks what I want instead of deciding what's convenient for you. Love includes me in conversations about my own future instead of making plans behind my back." "Mom, you're being dramatic," Linda said with an eye roll that transported me back 30 years to her teenage rebellion. Except now she was a grown woman dismissing her mother's legitimate concerns with the same casual cruelty. "Am I?" I asked, reaching into the folder Mr. Morrison had given me and pulling out a single sheet of paper. "Is it dramatic to discover that Michael has been accessing my bank accounts without my knowledge? Is it dramatic to learn that you've all been coordinating your approach to manipulating me into giving up my home and my independence?" The silence that followed was profound. David's face went pale. Linda's mouth opened and closed without sound. Michael's jaw tightened in that way it always had when he'd been caught in wrongdoing as a child. "Those are joint accounts," Michael said finally. "I'm authorized to access them." "Authorization you obtained through deception," I replied. "Authorization I revoked this afternoon, along with every other access point you'd created to monitor and control my finances." "You did what?" Linda demanded, her mask of concerned daughter finally slipping completely to reveal the calculating predator beneath. I protected myself from people who were pretending to love me while plotting to steal from me, I said. I consulted with an attorney today who confirmed that what you've been doing is called financial elder abuse, and it's a felony in Illinois. The word felony seemed to electrify the room. David actually stood up, as if he were preparing to leave immediately. Linda's face flushed red with what I recognized as frustrated greed rather than embarrassed shame. Michael's business negotiator composure cracked enough to reveal the angry entitlement beneath. "Mom, you're being completely unreasonable," he said, his voice rising. "We're trying to help you, and you're treating us like criminals." "If you don't want to be treated like criminals," I replied, with perfect calm, "then stop behaving like criminals." "We're your children," Linda shouted, apparently forgetting that this fact was supposed to give them unlimited access to exploit me rather than obligate them to treat me with respect and kindness. "Yes, you are," I agreed. "You're the children I raised to be honest, compassionate, and respectful. You're the children I sacrificed everything for, worked multiple jobs to support, gave up my own dreams to nurture. And now you're the adults who are trying to steal my home and my independence because you've decided you deserve your inheritance while I'm still alive to sign the papers." The brutal honesty of that statement hung in the air like a challenge. They could deny it, could manufacture more excuses about their concern for my welfare, but we all knew I'd identified their true motivation with surgical precision. "Look," David said, trying to inject some reasonableness into the charged atmosphere, "maybe we approached this wrong. Maybe we should have included you more in the planning process." "There shouldn't be a planning process," I said firmly. "This is my life, my home, my decision. The only planning required is for you to respect my choices instead of trying to override them for your own financial benefit." "Fine," Michael said, standing up and closing his briefcase with aggressive finality. "But don't come crying to us when you fall down those stairs or have a medical emergency with no one around to help." "I won't," I promised. "I'll handle my own emergencies the same way I've been handling everything else for the past 3 years. By myself, because that's apparently how you prefer it." Linda gathered her papers with sharp, angry movements. "You're making a huge mistake, Mom. And when you realize that, when you're ready to be reasonable about this, maybe we'll still be willing to help." "Help," I repeated, tasting the word like something bitter. "Is that what you call researching my assets? Touring nursing homes without my knowledge, and setting up unauthorized access to my bank accounts? If that's your idea of help, then I prefer to do without it." They filed out of my house with the sullen entitlement of children who'd been denied something they felt they deserved. No one said goodbye. No one expressed concern for my well-being or appreciation for the years I'd devoted to their happiness and success. They simply left, taking their schemes and manipulations with them, abandoning me to the independence they'd been trying so hard to steal. I watched through my front window as they stood in my driveway, clearly engaged in heated discussion about their failed intervention. Their body language was aggressive, frustrated, angry, the posture of people who'd been thwarted in their attempt to exploit someone they'd underestimated. When their cars finally disappeared down Elm Street, I closed my eyes and felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Complete peace. Not the peace of resignation or defeat, but the peace of standing in truth, of refusing to participate in my own destruction, of choosing self-respect over the desperate need to be loved by people who'd forgotten how to love. I walked to my Bible, still open on the kitchen table where I'd left it that morning, and read aloud from Ephesians. "Therefore, having put away falsehood, let each one of you speak the truth with his neighbor, for we are members one of another." I had spoken truth tonight, perhaps for the first time in years. I had named their behavior accurately, refused to enable their deception, and chosen to value my own well-being as much as I'd always valued theirs. Whether they chose to recognize that truth and change their behavior, or whether they chose to continue down the path of manipulation and exploitation, was no longer my responsibility. I had done my part by standing firm in honesty and self-protection. "I forgive you," I whispered toward the empty driveway. "But I won't enable you anymore." For the first time since this ordeal began, those words felt like prayer instead of defeat. Forgiveness didn't require me to accept abuse. Love didn't demand that I sacrifice my well-being on the altar of other people's convenience. I was still their mother, but I was also God's daughter, and He had created me to be valued and cherished, not used and discarded. Tonight, I had finally chosen to honor that truth, regardless of whether my own children were capable of recognizing it. The house felt different around me, not empty, but peaceful, not lonely, but sacred. This was my sanctuary, and I had successfully defended it from people who would have transformed it into just another asset to be liquidated for their benefit. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but it would also bring new opportunities to continue choosing truth over convenience, self-respect over people-pleasing, and God's definition of love over the counterfeit version my children had been offering. I was no longer afraid of their anger or their abandonment. I had survived both, and I was still standing strong in the life God had given me to live with dignity and purpose. The confrontation was over, but my real life was just beginning. 3 weeks after the confrontation that changed everything, I found myself doing something I hadn't done in over 5 years, laughing until my sides hurt. I was sitting in the community room at Grace Methodist Church, surrounded by 8 other women ranging in age from 68 to 81, all of us doubled over with mirth at something Dorothy Henderson had just said about her attempt to learn how to use Instagram to keep up with her grandchildren. I accidentally posted a photo of my breakfast to something called My Story, Dorothy wheezed between giggles, and within an hour I had 12 people commenting on my oatmeal. Apparently, I'm now famous for my cinnamon raisin combination. The Wednesday Women's Bible Study had become my lifeline in ways I never could have anticipated. After decades of believing that my spiritual community existed primarily within the walls of traditional Sunday services, I'd discovered a group of women who understood that faith was meant to be lived out loud, shared honestly, and celebrated with the kind of joy that comes from surviving enough of life's trials to recognize God's faithfulness in the midst of struggle. These weren't women who offered platitudes about everything happening for a reason, or who suggested that proper prayer could prevent all suffering. These were women who'd buried husbands and children, who'd survived betrayals and disappointments, who'd learned to distinguish between God's plan and other people's failures. They understood that faith sometimes meant standing up to family members who mistook love for enabling, that boundaries were biblical, and that self-care was actually stewardship of the life God had entrusted to each of us. "Margaret," said Ruth Collins, the group's unofficial leader despite being the youngest at 68, "you're absolutely glowing these days. Whatever you're doing differently, it's working." I thought about how to answer that question honestly. What was I doing differently? The external changes were obvious. I'd started attending this Bible study, had begun taking watercolor painting classes at the community center, had even signed up for a senior hiking group that met every Saturday morning at different nature preserves around central Illinois. But the internal changes felt more profound and harder to articulate. "I think I'm finally learning the difference between being loving and being a doormat," I said, surprising myself with how easily the words came. I spent so many years thinking that good Christian women were supposed to accept whatever treatment their families dished out. That forgiveness meant never setting boundaries or protecting yourself from people who were hurting you. "Oh, honey," said Eleanor Martinez, whose own adult children had tried to pressure her into selling her condo to help fund their business ventures. "That's not Christianity. That's just poor self-esteem dressed up in religious language." Eleanor was 81 and had the kind of sharp wisdom that comes from 8 decades of sorting truth from manipulation. She'd been the first person in the group to encourage me to change my phone number after my children began leaving increasingly angry voicemails demanding that I stop being stubborn and think about what's best for the family. What's best for the family, I'd finally realized, didn't include sacrificing my well-being, my independence, or my financial security to make their lives more convenient. Real love, the kind of love God modeled through Christ, sometimes required saying no to people you cared about when their requests would cause harm. "I've been reading Proverbs differently lately," I continued, pulling out the small notebook where I'd been recording insights from my daily devotions. All those passages about wisdom and discernment that I used to think were just nice sayings, I'm starting to understand they're actually practical instructions for protecting yourself from people who would take advantage of your goodness. Amen to that. said Carolyn Bishop, whose ex-husband had tried to convince her that Christian wives were supposed to tolerate financial abuse because divorce was unbiblical. Wisdom isn't just intellectual knowledge. It's emotional intelligence guided by the Holy Spirit. The conversation continued for another hour, weaving seamlessly between scripture and personal experience, between theological insights and practical advice about everything from dealing with manipulative relatives to finding joy in unexpected places. These women had become my true family, not because we shared blood, but because we shared values, mutual respect, and genuine concern for each other's well-being. After the meeting ended, I drove to my second new activity of the week, watercolor painting class at the Springfield Community Center. I'd never considered myself artistic, had always deferred to other people's creative talents while limiting myself to the purely functional tasks of homemaking and child-rearing. But Dorothy Henderson had convinced me that it was never too late to discover hidden gifts, and something about working with colors and brushes felt like prayer made visible. "Beautiful work, Margaret," said instructor Patricia Yates as she examined my latest attempt at capturing the maple tree outside my kitchen window. "You're really developing an eye for the way light changes the character of a subject." Light changing the character of a subject. The phrase resonated with me long after class ended. Wasn't that exactly what had happened in my own life? The harsh fluorescent glare of my children's manipulation had been replaced by the gentle illumination of God's love as experienced through people who actually valued my presence instead of just my usefulness. That afternoon, I returned home to find a letter in my mailbox that made my heart skip, not with dread, as mail from my children had been doing for weeks, but with genuine excitement. The envelope bore the return address of Sacred Heart Retirement Community. But this wasn't a sales pitch or an unsolicited brochure. This was a response to my inquiry about their volunteer program. I'd called them the previous week after learning that they needed people to lead art therapy sessions for residents with dementia. My newfound interest in watercolor painting, combined with my decades of experience in nurturing and patient care, seemed like skills I could share with people who might benefit from creative expression and gentle encouragement. The letter was an invitation to visit the facility, meet with their activities director, and discuss how I might contribute to their residents' quality of life. Instead of being warehoused in an institution as my children had planned, I would be entering one as a valued volunteer, someone whose life experience and renewed energy could bring joy and comfort to people who truly needed what I had to offer. The irony wasn't lost on me. My children had wanted to put me in assisted living because they'd decided I was too confused and declining to live independently. Now I was volunteering at a similar facility because I'd discovered I was still healthy, capable, and had gifts to share with people who would appreciate them. Saturday morning brought my weekly hike with the Springfield Seniors Outdoor Club, a group of 12 men and women who refused to let age limit their sense of adventure. Today's destination was Washington Park Prairie, a restored tallgrass prairie preserve where we could walk for miles through landscapes that looked much as they had when Illinois was first settled. "Margaret, you're really keeping up well for someone new to hiking?" said Bill Patterson. No relation to my neighbor Mrs. Patterson, but equally kind and encouraging. "Have you been active your whole life?" I considered the question as we walked through prairie grass that reached my waist, watching red-winged blackbirds dart between the seed heads while the autumn sun warmed my face. Had I been active? Not in the way Bill meant. I'd been busy, constantly in motion, always working to maintain a household, raise children, care for a husband, meet everyone else's needs. But active in the sense of choosing activities that brought me joy, that challenged my body and spirit in positive ways? This was entirely new territory. "No," I answered honestly. "But I'm making up for lost time." We walked for 3 miles through some of the most beautiful country I'd ever seen, pausing occasionally to identify wildflowers or watch hawks circling overhead. The physical exertion felt good, not like the exhausting busyness that had characterized most of my adult life, but like the satisfying tiredness that comes from choosing to push yourself towards something worthwhile. When we stopped for lunch at a picnic area overlooking a small lake, I found myself in conversation with Helen Morrison, a 70-year-old former teacher who'd been widowed 2 years earlier. "You know what I love about this group?" Helen said. unwrapping a sandwich while watching a great blue heron stalk fish in the shallows. Nobody here needs anything from me except companionship. For the first time in decades, I can just be myself without worrying about whether I'm meeting someone else's expectations or solving their problems. Her words perfectly captured something I'd been feeling but hadn't been able to articulate. For 73 years, my value had been tied to my usefulness to other people, as a daughter, wife, mother, caregiver, problem solver. These new relationships were based on entirely different foundations: shared interests, mutual respect, genuine affection that didn't come with strings attached or hidden agendas. That evening, I called Emma for the first time since my confrontation with her parents. I'd been hesitant to reach out, unsure whether Linda had poisoned my granddaughter against me with stories about my unreasonable behavior and confusion. But Emma was 12 years old enough to form her own opinions about whether her grandmother was declining or simply refusing to be exploited. "Grandma," Emma's voice was bright with genuine pleasure. "Mom said you were going through some kind of phase, but I told her you sounded fine to me when I talked to you last month." Some kind of phase. As if standing up for myself was a temporary aberration rather than a permanent commitment to self-respect and healthy boundaries. "How are you, sweetheart?" I asked, settling into Robert's chair with the phone pressed to my ear. "Tell me about school, about your friends, about everything I've been missing." For 20 minutes, Emma chatted about her classes, her soccer team, her best friend's drama with her boyfriend, and her excitement about the upcoming school play where she'd been cast as the narrator. She sounded happy, confident, untroubled by whatever tensions existed between the adults in her family. "Grandma," she said as our conversation was winding down, "could I maybe come spend a weekend with you soon? Like we used to do when I was little? I miss our cooking projects and the way you let me help with your garden." The request brought tears to my eyes. Not tears of sadness, but of gratitude for this reminder that love could still exist in my family relationships when they were allowed to develop naturally, instead of being filtered through other people's agendas and manipulations. "I would love that more than anything," I told her. "Let me talk to your mother about what weekend would work best." After hanging up, I sat in the quiet of my evening kitchen, watching the last light fade from the October sky. 3 weeks ago, I'd been consumed with grief over relationships that seemed irreparably damaged, convinced that choosing self-protection meant choosing isolation. Now I understood that protecting myself from people who didn't love me well had created space for relationships with people who did. The Wednesday women understood faith as strength rather than weakness. The hiking group appreciated my presence without needing anything from me beyond companionship. The art class celebrated my attempts at creativity without judgment or criticism. Even the volunteer opportunity at Sacred Heart offered a chance to give of myself from a place of fullness rather than depletion. I opened my Bible to Isaiah 43:19. "See, I am doing a new thing. Now it springs up. Do you not perceive it? I am making a way in the wilderness and streams in the wasteland." God was indeed doing a new thing in my life at 73. The wilderness of family betrayal and emotional manipulation was becoming a pathway to deeper faith, stronger relationships, and a more authentic version of myself than I'd ever had the courage to be before. My children might never understand or appreciate the woman I was becoming, but that was their loss, not mine. I was finally learning to live as God's beloved daughter, rather than just as other people's unpaid servant, and the freedom was intoxicating. "Thank you, Lord," I whispered into the peaceful darkness. "Thank you for loving me enough to let me discover who I really am when I'm not busy being who everyone else needs me to be." The house around me felt different now, not like a prison or a burden, but like the sanctuary it had always been meant to be. Tomorrow would bring new adventures, new opportunities to serve from a place of choice rather than obligation, new chances to experience the abundant life Jesus had promised to those who followed him. I was 73 years old, and my real life was just beginning. 6 months after the night that changed everything, I stood in my kitchen at dawn, watching the first spring crocuses push through the soil in my garden, tiny purple and white miracles that had survived the Illinois winter to bloom again. The symbolism wasn't lost on me. Sometimes what looks like death is actually preparation for the most beautiful resurrection. my hands wrapped around my coffee mug. I reflected on how dramatically my life had transformed since that devastating evening when my children had invaded my home with their schemes and ultimatums. The woman who had stood trembling in this same kitchen, wondering if God could even see her anymore, seemed like a stranger now, someone I remembered with compassion but no longer recognized as myself. The phone rang, interrupting my peaceful morning meditation. 6 months ago, an unexpected call would have sent my heart racing with anxiety about what crisis or demand awaited me. Now, I answered with calm curiosity, secure in the knowledge that my life belonged to me, and I had the strength to handle whatever came. Mrs. Thompson? This is Sarah Kim from the Springfield Journal. I'm calling about the feature article we're writing on local volunteers who are making a difference in our community. Your work at Sacred Heart Retirement Community has been recommended by several people as truly exceptional. A newspaper feature. About my volunteer work. I smiled, thinking about how my children had tried to convince everyone, including me, that I was declining, confused, unable to contribute meaningfully to anything. Yet here I was, 6 months later, being recognized for work that brought joy and purpose to both myself and the residents I served. I'm flattered, I replied, settling into Robert's chair to hear more about what this might involve. We'd love to interview you about your art therapy program and how you've been helping dementia patients express themselves through watercolor painting. The activities director says your sessions have become the most anticipated events of the week. After arranging an interview for the following Tuesday, I hung up feeling a familiar warmth, not the desperate need for validation that had once driven me to accept any crumb of appreciation from my children, but the quiet satisfaction that comes from knowing your gifts are being used exactly as God intended. The art therapy program had exceeded everyone's expectations, including my own. What had started as simple watercolor lessons had evolved into something much more profound, a way for people with dementia to access memories and emotions that words could no longer reach. Last week, a woman named Betty, who hadn't spoken in months, had painted a beautiful field of sunflowers and then whispered, "Kansas," as tears streamed down her face, connecting briefly with childhood memories of her family's farm. These moments felt like miracles, tiny resurrections of human dignity and connection that reminded everyone present, staff, volunteers, and residents, that the essence of who we are transcends whatever limitations age or illness might impose on our bodies and minds. The doorbell chimed just as I was finishing my second cup of coffee. Through the front window, I could see Emma standing on my porch, her school backpack slung over one shoulder and a wrapped package in her hands. My heart lifted with the pure joy that had become my default response to my granddaughter's visits. A joy uncomplicated by the tension and manipulation that characterized every interaction with her parents. "Surprise, Grandma," Emma announced as I opened the door. "Mom dropped me off early because she has some meeting, and I asked if I could spend the morning with you before school." These unexpected visits had become treasured gifts over the past 6 months. Linda still maintained a cool distance, clearly disapproving of my stubborn refusal to accept their plans for my future. But she'd stopped trying to prevent Emma from maintaining our relationship. Perhaps she'd realized that attempting to weaponize her daughter against me would backfire, revealing her own vindictiveness while only strengthening the bond between Emma and me. "I brought you something," Emma said, holding out the wrapped package with the proud excitement of someone who'd chosen the perfect gift. Inside was a small canvas painting, a watercolor rendering of my house as seen from the street, complete with the rose garden in full bloom and even my car in the driveway. "I've been taking art classes too," Emma explained, watching my face carefully for my reaction. "I wanted to paint something that would remind you how beautiful your home is, in case you ever start doubting it again." The gift was more profound than Emma probably realized. She had captured not just the physical details of my house, but its essence as a sanctuary, a place of beauty and peace worth protecting. Through her 12-year-old eyes, she had seen what her parents refused to acknowledge, that this wasn't just real estate to be liquidated, but a home where love had been cultivated and memories had been planted like perennial flowers that bloomed year after year. "It's absolutely perfect," I told her, meaning every word. "Would you help me find the perfect spot to hang it?" We spent 20 minutes debating the ideal location before settling on the kitchen wall where I could see it every morning during my devotional time. As Emma carefully held the painting in place while I marked the wall for hanging, I realized how naturally she had stepped into the role her parents had abandoned, that of family member who actually cared about my happiness and well-being. "Grandma," Emma said as we admired her artwork now properly displayed, "some kids at school were asking me about why my parents don't visit you very much anymore." I didn't know what to say. The question revealed how observant children are, how they notice when family relationships change even when adults think they're protecting them from grown-up problems. I considered how to answer honestly without burdening Emma with details she was too young to process. "Sometimes families go through difficult periods where people disagree about important things," I said carefully. "Your parents think they know what's best for me, and I think I know what's best for me, and we haven't been able to find a way to agree about that. Are you lonely without them?" Emma asked with the direct compassion that children possess before they learn to hide behind polite social conventions. "I miss the people they used to be," I answered truthfully, "but I'm not lonely. I have wonderful friends now, and meaningful work to do, and I have you. Plus, I've learned that being alone isn't the same thing as being lonely. Sometimes being alone is exactly what you need to remember who God created you to be." Emma nodded solemnly, processing this wisdom with the seriousness she brought to all our conversations. Our relationship had deepened considerably since I'd stopped trying to maintain artificial peace with her parents. Without the constant stress of managing their demands and criticism, I had emotional energy available for the kind of patient, nurturing presence that children need from grandparents. After Emma left for school, I drove to Sacred Heart for my morning volunteer session. The residents had come to expect me every Tuesday and Friday, and their faces lit up when I entered the activities room with my basket of painting supplies. Today, we were working on spring landscapes, an appropriate metaphor for renewal and new beginnings that resonated with people who understood that life contained many seasons, some harder than others. "Margaret, dear," said Rose Patterson, a 93-year-old former schoolteacher whose mind remained sharp despite her body's frailties, "you seem different today, even happier than usual, if such a thing is possible." I considered her observation as I helped her mix colors for the sky in her painting. Was I happier? The question might have seemed absurd 6 months ago when I was consumed with grief over my children's betrayal and convinced that choosing self-protection meant choosing isolation. But Rose was right. There was a lightness in my spirit that hadn't been there even a few weeks ago. "I think I'm finally learning to receive God's love the way He intended," I replied, surprised by my own insight. For so many years, I thought His love had to come through other people, especially family. When they stopped loving me well, I thought maybe God had stopped loving me too. But now I understand that His love comes directly to me, and anything good I receive from other people is just bonus blessing on top of what He's already given. Rose smiled with the satisfaction of someone who'd learned the same lesson through her own difficult journey. "Took me 80 years to figure that out," she said. "You're ahead of schedule." That afternoon brought an unexpected visitor, Michael, standing on my front porch with an expression I hadn't seen since he was a teenager caught in wrongdoing. Gone was the business executive confidence he'd worn during our last confrontation. In its place was something that looked almost like humility, though I'd learned not to trust appearances when it came to my children's motivations. "Hi, Mom," he said when I opened the door. "Could we talk?" I invited him in, noting how different this felt from their coordinated ambush 6 months earlier. This time, Michael was alone, and his body language suggested someone who was asking for a conversation rather than demanding compliance with predetermined plans. We sat in my living room, the same space where he and his siblings had once tried to present their case for dismantling my independence. But the dynamic had shifted completely. I was no longer the overwhelmed woman who'd been defensive about her right to make her own decisions. I was someone who'd discovered her strength, her worth, and her ability to thrive without their approval or assistance. "I've been thinking a lot about our conversation in December," Michael began, his voice carrying none of the patronizing authority that had characterized our previous interactions. "About things you said that I didn't want to hear at the time." I waited, curious to see where this would lead, but no longer desperate for any particular outcome. If Michael had come to apologize and rebuild our relationship on healthier terms, I would welcome that. If this was another manipulation attempt, I had the tools and confidence to recognize it and protect myself accordingly. I think maybe we were wrong, he continued. The admission clearly difficult for someone accustomed to being right about financial and practical matters. Not about being concerned for your safety, but about how we went about expressing that concern. And maybe about assuming we knew better than you did what would make you happy. Maybe, I asked gently, recognizing that this was probably as close to a full acknowledgement as Michael was capable of making. Definitely, he corrected, offering a rueful smile that reminded me of the boy he'd once been. We were definitely wrong. I can see now how it must have felt like we were trying to control you instead of help you. The conversation continued for an hour, with Michael sharing how my firm boundaries had forced him to examine his own motivations and assumptions. He'd apparently been shocked to discover that I was not only managing perfectly well without their assistance, but actually thriving in ways that made their concerns about my decline seem absurd. "The newspaper called me yesterday," he said as our conversation was winding down. "They wanted to verify some information for an article they're writing about your volunteer work. The activities director at Sacred Heart told them you're one of the most effective volunteers they've ever had." I smiled, remembering how he'd once suggested I had memory issues that would prevent me from living independently. Now strangers were calling him to praise my competence and contribution to the community. "I don't expect things to go back to the way they were," Michael said finally. "I know we damaged your trust, and I know that trust has to be rebuilt slowly, but I hope maybe we can start over, with more respect for your autonomy and your judgment." It was an olive branch, imperfectly offered but seemingly sincere. I accepted it cautiously, with clear boundaries about what reconciliation would look like. There would be no return to the old patterns, where their needs automatically took precedence over mine, where my resources were assumed to be available for their convenience, where my preferences were overruled by their supposedly superior wisdom. I would like that, I told him, but it has to be based on recognizing that I'm a competent adult who gets to make her own decisions about her life, even when those decisions aren't what you would choose for me. That evening, I sat in my garden as the sun set behind the maple tree Emma had painted so beautifully. The crocuses that had pushed through the soil that morning were fully open now, purple and white stars scattered across the dark earth like promises that winter never had the final word. My phone buzzed with a text message from Dorothy Henderson. "Can't wait for tomorrow's Bible study. I've got the most amazing testimony about God's faithfulness to share with the group." These were my people now. Women who understood that faith meant trusting God enough to value yourself as He valued you, who knew that boundaries were biblical, who celebrated each other's victories without jealousy or competition. They would gather tomorrow in the church fellowship hall, and we would study scripture and share wisdom and laugh until our sides hurt, and I would drive home feeling filled rather than drained. "Thank you, Lord," I whispered to the darkening sky, "for teaching me the difference between being loved and being used. Thank you for showing me that your plans for me are good, even when they don't look like what I expected. Thank you for proving that it's never too late to discover who you created me to be." A year ago, I had been a woman who believed her value depended on her usefulness to people who had forgotten how to appreciate her. Tonight, I was a woman who knew herself to be God's beloved daughter, worthy of respect and kindness, capable of creating beauty and bringing joy to others, strong enough to protect herself from anyone who would diminish her worth. The transformation hadn't been easy, but it had been worth every difficult moment. I was 73 years old, and I was finally free to live the abundant life Jesus had promised. Not just in heaven someday, but right here, right now, in a house I'd chosen to keep, surrounded by people who valued my presence, engaged in work that honored my gifts, secure in the knowledge that God's love for me never depended on anyone else's approval. Have you ever experienced or witnessed someone close to you go through a situation like Margaret's, where family relationships became complicated by competing interests and lack of respect? How did faith help navigate those difficult waters? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If this story touched your heart, please like this video and subscribe to our channel so this message can reach someone who needs to hear it today. Sometimes God uses our stories to remind others that they're not alone, that they're worthy of love and respect, and that it's never too late to choose dignity over convenience. May God bless everyone who's been through something like this. Everyone who's had to choose between being loved and being respected. Everyone who's discovered that sometimes protecting yourself is the most loving thing you can do. In Jesus' name, amen.